Thanks, Eddie, and thank you again for the invitation to what is a unique event in the Irish public calendar. I can't claim to be a MacGill virgin, but each time the thrill gets better. Our government has done well in a few areas. There is a prospect that we might get some amelioration in the bank debt. The government has brought political stability and is headed in the right direction, and Enda Kenny and Michael Noonan deserve credit. That assessment comes from, of all people, Vincent Browne, writing in last Sunday's Business Post. As I glanced up in Clondalkin to see if there were any pigs flying overhead, I realised that maybe the grand old Inquisitor had a momentary lapse. There is no doubt but that the government has made progress and significant in some areas and less than we would like in other areas. The significance of the breakthrough on inherited bank debt cannot be exaggerated, and the scale of the unemployment challenge confronting us cannot be played down. There is no precedent for the second most senior minister in government, in public at any rate, saying that on taking office his government faced an existential crisis. And yet people acknowledge that Eamon Gilmore's admission last Sunday here at MacGill was no more than a statement of the obvious. There were days when we feared for the financial survival of the state. The financial and economic meltdown threw up a new government, but it didn't throw up a new economy. The new government was stuck with the inherited economic wreckage and dependent on the kindness of strangers to fund the state. So long as we comply with their strictures, we get by. But if we don't comply, there is no sentiment. Ask the people of Greece. Notwithstanding these obvious facts of life, there are still some politicians and some commentators who think that money will fall down from the sky. Meanwhile, Glenty's kicked off to lead the casual observer to believe that the forces of good are gathered here in a futile attempt to stem the tide of corruption that supposedly threatens to engulf the Irish polity. New, born-again Fianna Fáil want me to sign a pledge to keep the law. And then it seems we need another Quango to ride shotgun on members of the Dáil. Does anybody seriously believe that taking the pledge would stop Liam Lawler or Ray Burke or P. Flynn from behaving as they did? You cannot legislate for virtue. We can, and we have, and we should, and we are putting in place a body of law that, insofar as is reasonably possible, provides a transparent standard to which politicians are expected to conform. The funding of politics has been cleaned up. Lobbyists will have to come out into the light. Whistleblowing is encouraged and will be protected. And the most far-reaching anti-corruption bill in Western Europe is being enacted. And there's more to come. I don't agree that a half a dozen dishonest politicians in the last 30 years proves that Irish politics is rotten or irredeemably corrupt. I have spent a good deal of my political life opposing the schemes and subterfuges of the same half dozen gentlemen. And the damage that infected the body politic arising from the conduct of that half dozen dishonest senior politicians is graphically exposed in the report of the Mahon Tribunal. But I reject the proposition that people go into politics for what they can get out of it. There are people in politics in all parties for no other reason than to prosecute their own perception of public service. And just like I pay tribute to the well-established reputation of Tom O'Higgins as a man of integrity in his profession. I wouldn't like to look too deeply in that profession, because ever since the Goodman Tribunal, we couldn't have had the scandals that we've had in this country if your profession was doing what they ought to have been doing. Nor do I think it right, if people opt to make a living from this uncertain profession, that somehow there's a necessity to apologise for it. We need more businessmen in politics, according to the critics. But if a businessman in politics falls victim to the business cycle, then there are reams of purple prose for days. Much of the coverage will make no distinction between the businessman politician who breaks the law and the businessman politician caught in the business collapse. Ministers, we are told, must not have constituency duties, but at the same time it's imperative that ministers are held to account. To whom better to be held to account than by your own constituents? I was struck by what Noel Whelan is reported to have said here on Monday, when he professed his conviction that the revelations of corruption on the part of some elements in Fianna Fáil, quote, had no electoral implications. I think he's probably right. The economic collapse caused the collapse of Fianna Fáil. After all, the electorate in 2007 knew all they needed to know about Bertie Ahern, and yet they went ahead and re-elected him. Why is there a constant need to assert that nothing has changed when this is manifestly untrue? Has anybody paused to wonder where the relentless denigration of politics will lead us? What have the new crop of TDs, almost half of the Dáil, what have they done to earn inclusion in a pantheon of rogues? I appreciate that people are angry about the political and institutional negligence that has caused such hardship, and they're right to be angry. But why deliberately confuse this dereliction of duty with corruption? Why can't performance, accountability and reform be debated without making headline-grabbing claims that this is an irredeemably corrupt republic? The law has not yet been imagined that can prevent a politician from abusing his office if he's determined to do so. Why can't we accept that there is now a new dispensation comprising new rules and new laws, and then move on to the real reform debate? I do accept that a cultural shift must be at the heart of the reform agenda. Following Rahm Emanuel's advice that one should never let a serious crisis go to waste, I would suggest that unless we take this opportunity to redesign our public services, we will remain condemned to pro-cyclical policy making because of an administrative system that is unwilling and unable to speak the truth to power, or in some cases even to ascertain what that truth might be in the first place. There is an impressive list of projects currently being progressed by the Minister for Public Expenditure. The reform and extension of the Freedom of Information Act, a review and modernisation of ethics legislation, the regulation of lobbying, a bill to safeguard confidential information communicated to a public representative, new cross-sectoral whistleblower protection, an extension of the Ombudsman's remit, establishing a legal framework for Oireachtas inquiries, and a review of the legal framework for civil service accountability. But those who have been crying for reform choose not to want to know about it. And of course, in a matter of detail, know damn little about it. This is a coordinated attempt on the part of the government to address the serious concerns of our citizens and to restore some level of trust in Ireland's political and administrative structure. Trust is a fragile attribute, easily damaged and extremely hard to repair. It can be damaged, sometimes fatally, by a single catastrophic failure, but can also be just as fatally undermined by being constantly eroded by cynicism and a focus on the negative. I want to highlight one issue in particular: our need to reassess how the government, civil servants and individual ministers are accountable to the Oireachtas in a meaningful way for the actions they take. This raises fundamental questions about the respective roles of ministers and civil servants. As an opposition TD, I have long been frustrated by what I think are 19th century notions of the minister's personal responsibility for all the acts of his or her civil servants, regardless as to whether they are done under his direction or even with his knowledge or consent. This can lead to a situation where accountability to the Oireachtas is demanded on an entirely fictitious basis. The result is that if questions are asked as to who actually decided what, when and why, a corporate veil can descend upon the entire department. Both the minister and officials engage in a form of collective self-defence in order to obscure the actual decision-making process and to prevent identification of the individuals involved at any level. I've described the position as a Faustian pact involving an abnegation of public personality on the part of civil servants and an excessive fascination with the role of the minister. In return for defending his department as if its actions were all his own, the minister is guaranteed that he will never walk alone and never be short of something to say in his own defence. We now have departments of state that function under two parallel systems of management. Under the Constitution and under the Ministers and Secretaries Acts, departments are administered by ministers who are personally responsible for the performance of functions. Under the Public Service Management Act, these same departments are managed by Secretaries General and functions are assigned and performed by civil servants who are accountable to the Secretary General and not to the Minister. What's the difference between administering a department, a ministerial function, and managing a department, the function of the Secretary General? It seems to me that the two terms are legally synonymous. It is as if we have invented a pyramid with twin pinnacles, a contradiction in terms. Because of this, accountability does not work as it should. When ministers are to blame, the system should identify that rather than shielding them. But when civil servants get it wrong, we're entitled to know that too, and what the minister did about it. Another issue I've highlighted is that our law requires that a civil servant must not express any public opinion on the merits of policy or the objectives of policy. This seems to me to make it impossible for civil servants to speak on their own behalf, or where appropriate, to defend themselves and their actions. I thought John's speech was interesting, but I think it was more subtle than one might think. I saw it as an attempt to pen responsibility for the mess we're in on the civil and public service. And yes, they do take a share of the blame, but by God, they're not the only ones who take a share of the blame. This can also be a cloak which deprives the Oireachtas from getting a full narrative as to the way decisions were arrived at. It's an issue we have to resolve if we're to have an adequate parliamentary banking inquiry, for example. As a minister, I value the relationship between the civil service and the minister. This key relationship is built largely on trust, but it is also by its nature ambiguous and lacking in clarity as to the specific roles of the players. Ambiguity is defended on the basis that it supports a flexible and collaborative public service where the elasticity of individual roles allows for a quick response to changing demands. But ambiguity also allows for vagueness as to who is responsible for what and to whom are they accountable. So there are many practical steps that we can and should take to transform the civil service accountability landscape. And our agenda includes the following: a review of the Ministers and Secretaries Act to assess the benefit of defining in law the power of civil servants to perform ministerial acts without recourse to the minister; amending the Public Service Management Act to clarify the separate roles and responsibilities of ministers and civil servants; changing the restrictions on civil service evidence to Oireachtas committees; making CEOs of state agencies accountable to the Oireachtas and responsible for directly answering questions in the Dáil, restating and inculcating the values and ethos of the civil service, examining the scope for a greater delegation of budgets and loosening central sanctioning controls, reviewing our state agency boards and abolishing those where direct accountability from the CEO to the Minister would result in enhanced governance arrangements, providing extra powers to the Controller and Auditor General, promoting better record keeping, particularly in relation to key decisions involving ministers. My vision of civil service accountability is one which redefines the relationship between ministers and their departments. It should be possible to identify the relevant individuals and their roles, recognise good performance, encourage civil servants to speak more openly about their roles, and then, where necessary, identify what went wrong. It should be the case that if a minister takes a decision personally, he or she should say so and account for it. If the decision is taken within the department under a delegated power, then the relevant named official should say so and account for it. The minister would then have to account for the degree of supervision he or she exercised over the department in relation to the exercise within it of delegated powers. Civil service reform and the Croke Park Agreement are linked in the public mind, but not, I think, entirely accurately. That agreement is a negotiated settlement by way of a standard collective agreement of threatened industrial action. It is not a social partnership agreement with all of the additionalities entailed by that process. It is instead, as described by Shea Cody of Impact, a traditional type of agreement between a trade union and what we all have to recognise as a broke employer, designed to protect staff while reducing costs. And the agreement is designed to allow for the extraction of costs from the public service while holding open the prospect of a recovery of lost income over time. Under Croke Park, staff are cooperating with cost extraction in a way never done before. The recent agreement on sick pay is a case in point. So, Croke Park is concerned with the sort of changes to work practices that can save the government money. The wider reform agenda overlaps to some extent, but is aimed at reforms that transform the civil service and enables us not simply to get by with less, but to do better with less. I wonder whether we need to make more dramatic changes in civil service organisation than simply examining pay and allowances. While all of the debate is about pay, grading also deserves some analysis. A reduction in the number of grades might not only simplify payroll and pension administration, but might reduce current levels of bureaucracy, the same job being done several times due to personnel at different grade levels checking and rechecking the same tasks. I do recognise that some departments have reorganised dramatically compared to, say, 20 years ago in terms of staff deployment. It may have taken 20 years to do it, and perversely, it may only have been possible because of the twin evils of decentralisation and the recession. And I also recognise the diversity of the civil service. Departments differ dramatically. My department does not really have any customer-facing functions, and we are tiny by comparison with others. We should be wary of any one-size-fits-all proposals. Indeed, we should be encouraging diverse responses to meet our different needs. Therefore, the uniform hierarchical structure that pervades all our departments may no longer be uniformly appropriate, and we should be looking to accommodate, where appropriate, a de-layered team and process-based organisation. Finally, one characteristic all departments have in common is that the successive recruitment embargoes since the 70s have resulted in an ageing civil service. While their analytical and management skills may be transferable, the experience each one has acquired in his or her role is a vital departmental resource and cannot easily be replaced. Across all departments, decentralisation did untold damage in terms of dispersal and loss of expertise and waste of time and costs. As the moratorium continues, it will become increasingly harder to manage with diminished resources. We all aspire to doing more with less. What we need to avoid is doing less and worse with the fewer remaining resources. That would be one of the most damaging and lasting consequences of losing our economic sovereignty. So it is vital that we learn to nurture our resources and to organise them sustainably and productively. Thank you.